There's no better way to kick off the summer than with a backyard barbecue, and since currently my kitchen is completely unusable, I've decided to head to my backyard and barbecue some molasses-covered pork shoulder using a recipe from 1839. So thank you to NordVPN for sponsoring this video as I trace the origins of barbecue, this time on Tasting History. So as I mentioned in my last video, I am without a kitchen for about a month, so I figured it'd be a good excuse to do some outdoor cooking. And when I think of outdoor cooking, I first, of course, think of barbecue. And now that word, barbecue, is rather fraught because it has lots of meanings. First of all, it can be a noun, a verb, and an adjective, and even inside of those, there are multiple meanings. You can barbecue, barbecued barbecue at a barbecue with barbecue. It's ridiculous. And when it comes to the verb form specifically, there is a lot of argument exactly over what it means. Purists would say that to barbecue is to slowly cook something away from a heat source, mostly with smoke, as opposed to grilling like you would a hamburger. We call them both barbecue very often, but to many, they're not the same. But historically, the term barbecue had a lot of different meanings, especially in old cookbooks. If you look at many of the early recipes for barbecue, it's made indoors in an oven, which I don't quite see how that's barbecue, but they called it barbecue. Luckily, the oldest recipe that I could find for something called barbecue is done outdoors over hot coals, so that's what I'm going to make. It comes from the 1839 cookbook, The Kentucky Housewife by Mrs. Lettice Bryan, and it is for barbecued shote. And a shote is a pig that has been weaned. So like not quite a piglet, but not quite a full-grown pig. So it's for barbecued shote. Take either a hind or forequarter, rub it well with salt, pepper, and a small portion of molasses, and if practicable, let it lie for a few hours. Then rinse it clean and wipe it dry with a cloth and place it on a large gridiron over a bed of clear coals. Do not barbecue it hastily, but let it cool slowly for several hours, turning it over occasionally and basting it with nothing but a little salt water and pepper, merely to season and moisten it a little. When it is well done, serve it without a garnish. Simple, almost too simple, and that's why I'm also going to be making a recipe for a sauce. It's a sort of sauce that is the precursor to a Carolina-style barbecue sauce, but we'll get to that later. First, we're going to start with the pork. Now, I couldn't get a shote, so I'm just using pork shoulder, which is perfect for pulled pork. So first, mix about a tablespoon of pepper with a tablespoon or so of salt, and then rub it all over the pork. If you need more of either, that's fine, just don't under-season it. Then slather it in a thin layer of molasses. After that, put it into the fridge for about 4 hours and then take it out and rinse it off. The issue here is that I am without a kitchen, so I couldn't really rinse it off unless I took it into the bathtub, and that just seemed unsanitary, so I wiped it down as well as I could, and that'll just have to do. Then I set some coals and pecan wood on one side of the grill, and then got another 5 or so coal briquettes smoldering and added them to one side of the pile. The idea is that you want this to burn for about 8 hours because you want to keep it at a low temperature and you want to do it for a very long time. The one thing that you must do, I feel, for flavor is add some wood because that smoke is really what's going to flavor this meat. That's why, honestly, a smoker would have been better. My brother has a Traeger that he's always talking about, but I don't have one. Also, filming in my backyard is a lot harder than I thought because I don't know if you can hear, but there's like a World War II prop plane flying over. The birds are fighting. It's absolutely pandemonium back here. I usually think of it as so quiet until I need it to be quiet, and then it is not quiet at all. Anyway, once I got the coals going, I set the lid on and waited for it to reach about 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Then I did the obligatory tongue click, at which point I added the meat away from the coals and over a pan to catch any drippings. Now ideally you want the pork fat side up, so as the fat renders, it kind of melts all through the pork. Unfortunately, the way that my butcher cut it, it would only go on its side, so I was fat on the side, and it worked, but, not great. Also, I do have a newfound respect for people who barbecue a lot. I don't barbecue that much. Keeping that temperature, you want to keep it between 225 and 250. Keeping that temperature range is actually a lot harder than I thought and required a lot of attention. It's really a full-time job. Now the goal is to get the pork to about 200, 205 degrees Fahrenheit, and that can take several hours, usually about 90 minutes a pound. And while it's doing that, every hour or so, she says to baste it. I found that just squirting some water over it would do just fine, some salt water, but you can baste, you can squirt, whatever, you just want to keep it nice and moist. Oh, also wanted to point out my new apron, so I'll put a link in the description. Also, if you want, once the pork hits 160 or 165, you can wrap it up in aluminum foil and put it back. This will help keep moisture in, and it will make it a lot easier to take it out when it starts to fall apart, which hopefully it will near the end. The recipe, though, doesn't say that, so I just left it in there until it hit around 205. It ended up taking quite a while. It was actually dark before that happened. Luckily, that gives us plenty of time to talk about the history of barbecue. Talking about the history of barbecue is kind of difficult because first you have to decide what is barbecue. I mean, people have been heating food over hot coals since there were people and coals and food. Every society throughout history has had some form of meat cooked on or near a wood fire, but they didn't call it barbecue. The word barbecue doesn't come along until rather recently, a few hundred years ago, and there are a few theories of where the term comes from. One, which is almost definitely not true, is that it comes from the French barbe à queue, which roughly means beard to tail, referring to the roasting of a whole pig. This is the story that you'll find on menus sometimes, or in pretty much every 19th century cookbook, but like I said, no reason to think that that's true. Most linguists agree that it actually comes from the Arawak language spoken by most of the Taino people of the Caribbean. Their word was probably something along the lines of either barabicu or barboca, which the Spanish transcribed as barbacoa. Though the first time that the word barbacoa actually appears, it's not talking about cooking, it's talking about guarding over corn. In 1526, the Spanish soldier and historian Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo wrote of the Taino people growing corn, and when it is well grown, it is necessary to put a guard on it. They make a scaffolding meant to look like a tree. It is made of wood and reeds and covered with branches, and this scaffolding they call barbacoas. And the young boys hunt the parrots and other birds that come to eat the cornfields. That same type of structure at different heights was used for storing food, sometimes obviously for cooking over open flames, and even for sleeping. And that's how William Dampier, who was a buccaneer, used it. He said, "We lay there all night upon our barbecues, or frames of sticks raised about 3 foot from the ground." Though quickly both barbacoa and the English barbecue came to refer to cooking meat, though not always animals, at least at first. In fact, the very first use of the English word barbecue came in 1661, when Edmund Hickeringle wrote that some are slain and their flesh forthwith barbecued. And he was not referring to animals, but to people. In fact, it's around this time and place that the term cannibal comes into use. And originally, it referred to the people of the Caribbean. And while barbecuing did quickly come to refer to the cooking of animals, it had some difficulty overcoming its less savory past, especially amongst the Europeans. See, early European settlers had real trouble coming to terms with barbecue. On the one hand, it is a delicious way to cook your meat. On the other hand, they associated it with the native population who they looked down on. And when it did become popular with the Europeans, much of the actual cooking was done by enslaved Africans, and so that added a whole nother level of racism and class dynamics. And it wasn't just the colonists, but those back in Europe as well. In 1707, in England, Edward Ward wrote The Barbecue Feast, or The 3 Pigs of Peckham, broiled under an apple tree. The cooks were numberless, the company masterless, the meats carved with hatchets, and punch drunk by pailfuls. I love those old titles. They were really, really long and would give away half of the book, but they had character. Anyway, in this book, he describes the colonists, the English colonists, having a big old barbecue where they roasted pigs over hot coals, and they basted them with foxtails on sticks that were dipped in Madeira wine and Virginia pepper. And overall, he seems to have really enjoyed the food, but the preparation, he kind of had questions about, and he actually warns his audience. Those of more sophisticated tastes should now take a deep breath and hold their noses, or just look away as we delve into the history of this most American food. And perhaps it's because it was such an American food that barbecue, at least here in the US, ended up becoming associated with the 4th of July very, very early on. In fact, in 1839, the year that our recipe is from, there is a letter from, or I think a journal from a well-to-do woman in South Carolina who talks about traveling quite a ways just to attend a 4th of July barbecue. The family went in 2 carriage loads. This queue, like all other queues, consisted of eating a great deal and having a great deal more than could be eaten, although there were a great many persons present. These ceremonies over, we all partook standing of a dinner in the grove. The gentlemen of our party took us to the carriage and treated us to as many fine watermelons as we could eat, brought from Augusta. 4th of July barbecues were especially popular in the South, and actually even before the 4th of July was a thing, barbecues were popular in the South. Even George Washington was known to host or travel to barbecues on several occasions. His journal entry from May of 1769 said, "Went into Alexandria to a barbecue and stayed all night." Now there are several reasons why barbecuing was especially popular in the South, but the main reason was because of slavery. For the enslaved population of the South, barbecues weren't only a special occasion occurrence, but on a smaller scale, a daily method of cooking, which is why, to this day, it's a staple of African American cuisine. And even barbecue styles that later on have a lot of European influence can usually trace their roots back to those early barbecues on plantations. And it was on those plantations that barbecue first became associated with politics. See, there was a time, especially in the South, where it was seen as uncouth, unseemly for a politician to actively campaign. So instead, the candidate or one of their supporters would host massive barbecues where they could make their platform known without actively soliciting votes. And that's probably why, even today, barbecues are often a stop on any political campaign. And now, while it was mostly in the South that these political barbecues began, they didn't stay there. In fact, by the mid-19th century, they had moved all the way west to Oregon. Louis Albert Banks, writing about his childhood in Oregon in the 1860s, wrote that an interesting feature of many of the great political meetings in western backwoods times was the barbecue, which usually went with it. Instead of taking up collection of money for campaign purposes, the political committees would go about through the neighborhood and get donations of fat steers and sheep and hogs. He says they'd dig these big old pits and fill them with wood and burn them down, so by midnight they were just coals, and that's when they would start cooking the food, so that by noon the next day, the crowd gathered from 20 to 30 miles about, and there were often thousands of men and women and children in the big grove, whose nostrils, taking in the savory smell from the barbecue pit, were making their appetites ravenous. Now, when you are cooking for thousands of people, then it's worth the labor-intensive process of digging pits and barbecuing tons and tons of meat. But when you just want to make a little barbecue for your family, it's not really worth it. So when was it that barbecues moved to the backyard? Well, it started with time-saving briquettes. In 1897, Ellsworth Zwoyer patented an idea for a machine to press charcoal into briquettes, and it didn't see much real-world application until Henry Ford in the 1920s. See, his Model T car used a lot of wood for the dashboard and parts of the chassis and everything, and using that wood, they would end up with a lot of scraps. So he had his friend, Thomas Edison, design a plant that would turn these trimmings into charcoal briquettes. These were then sold alongside portable grill kits to people who purchased his cars to encourage them to drive out camping where they could cook outdoors. Now, the man who ran this operation for him was the husband of his cousin, a man named Edward Kingsford, and eventually changed the name to Kingsford Charcoal, which now makes 80% of the charcoal briquettes in the US, including the ones that I'm using today. The next development that brought barbecuing to the backyard was in the form of the barbecue itself, because following World War II, there was not only a baby boom, but also a boom in the desire to barbecue food, just like many of the GIs had seen be done in the South Pacific. See my video on the luau to hear all about that. See, tiki culture became all the rage in the late 40s and early 50s, and so people wanted to throw tiki parties in their backyard, but digging a pit for a pig luau is not really practical, so they would often build brick barbecues in their backyard. Also not very practical and really, really expensive. Enter George Stephan. Now, Stephan in the early 1950s loved barbecuing for his family, but he didn't have a fancy brick barbecue in his backyard, so he used these portable barbecue grills, kind of like the ones that you'd see like at a public park today. They were really just a metal box with a grate on top, and then you'd fill it with hot coals. They were not great. But George was a consummate tinkerer and was determined to build a better barbecue. Now, he worked as a salesperson at the Weber Brothers Metalworks in Chicago. And one of the things they manufactured was buoys for the US Coast Guard. So he sliced one of these buoys in half, put a curved lid on it, and stuck the whole thing on 3 legs. Then he poked a few holes in the top, a few in the bottom, set a grill inside, and thus was born George's Barbecue Kettle. And after a few design changes, it quickly usurped the place of not only the boxy grill he was trying to replace, but basically every other grill on the market. And to this day, the Weber Kettle Grill is by far the most popular charcoal grill in the US. Now, in recent years, gas has actually become the more popular way of grilling in the backyard, but you don't get that nice smoky flavor with gas, which is why I am using a Weber grill to make my 19th century barbecued pork. Though the 19th century recipe does not call for any kind of barbecue sauce. She does say to serve it with wine and melted butter, not really barbecue sauce. Nor is the recipe that I'm going to be making today. It's not called barbecue sauce, but it was a sauce meant to be served with all kinds of meats, and it is, I think, like a precursor to the Carolina barbecue sauce of today that has a vinegar base. It comes from Housekeeping in Old Virginia from 1879 and says, as the housekeeper is sometimes hurried in preparing a dish, it will save time and trouble for her to keep on hand a bottle of meat flavoring compounded of the following ingredients: 2 chopped onions, 3 pods of red pepper, chopped, 2 tablespoonfuls brown sugar, 1 tablespoonful celery seed, 1 tablespoonful ground mustard, 1 teaspoonful turmeric, 1 teaspoonful black pepper, 1 teaspoonful salt. Put all in a quart bottle and fill it up with cider vinegar. And I suggest making this a few days before you're actually going to use it, just so all those flavors in the jar or bottle can get together and get to know each other. So mix the brown sugar, celery seed, ground mustard, turmeric, black pepper, and salt in a bowl, and then add the chopped onions and the chopped red pepper. I'm using red jalapeno. And you want everything minced as fine as you can. Then add all of that to a quart-sized jar and fill it with unfiltered apple cider vinegar. Give it a shake and let it sit until your pork is ready. Which mine is, or was, because I actually did this yesterday. I did the cooking yesterday. I thought it was going to take 6 to 8 hours. It ended up taking like over 12. It was dark by the time it was done, but still worked. So once it hit 205 degrees Fahrenheit, I removed it from the grill and wrapped it in some foil so it would slowly cool over the next hour, and then I began to shred it to pieces. And here we are, barbecued pork from 1839. So one thing you're going to definitely want to do is really just salt this very, very well. Some of the salt makes it through, but it's a thick piece of meat, so you need to add more salt. I'm figuring it's because of the molasses. It got really nice and dark and smells great. Here we go. Not only is it just so tender, but it is smoky in a good way. I like a smoky flavor. That is wonderful. Honestly, you do need the salt, but you don't really need anything else. I mean, I love barbecue sauce, so that'd be great, but you don't need it. I am going to try just a bit of this. So it's, again, it's not barbecue sauce, but it is kind of a precursor. Let me just taste it first. Whew. That packs a punch. It's a little spicy, but really, really flavorful, and not too vinegary. I was worried it was going to just be like heck of vinegary. I'm gonna try it all together. Mighty fine. Took all day to make. Absolutely worth it. So thank you so much for following me out of the kitchen and into my backyard with the birds and all. Sorry about the birds. I know it's only 30 feet away, but to me, feels like a whole new world out here. I'm not very comfortable filming out here. Might as well be in Egypt, which is actually where my parents are right now. I'm really, really jealous about that, but makes a perfect segue to our sponsor today, NordVPN, because last night my mom called me and was asking me how she can log in to NordVPN. See, she had some online banking to do, and being in Egypt on public Wi-Fi, she didn't feel terribly comfortable with that, and so she wanted every protection she could possibly get. NordVPN to the rescue. See, there are lots of ways that people can intercept your personal data online, and using public Wi-Fi is one of the most common ways that can happen. But when you're logged into NordVPN, they encrypt your online traffic so your private data stays private. They also help you remember that private data, mainly your passwords. I am trying to get better at making unique, very long, complicated passwords, but I have so much trouble remembering them. So luckily, I have NordPass, where I can put all of those passwords in there, and it keeps them safe, but then I can just log into NordPass and see all of my passwords. It makes life so much easier. And right now, you can get a huge discount with the purchase of a 2-year plan plus 4 extra months when you use my link, nordvpn.com/maxmiller. That's nordvpn.com/maxmiller, and I will see you next time on Tasting History, maybe again in the backyard, but the birds, so I might try to figure something else out. Either way, see you next week.